Hey folks, Brandon Vigliarolo with the Register, and I'm here today with Yaniv Vardi, CEO of industrial cybersecurity firm Claroty, to talk about this recent rash of physical security threats to critical infrastructure that we've been tracking. Yaniv, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Brandon.
Yeah. So, I wrote last week about or maybe 2 weeks ago now, about a California, or an airport in Sacramento, California that had an internet cable cut. We've written multiple times recently about, people shooting up power grid infrastructure, right? And then we've got the Red Sea subsea cables, right, that may or may not have been physically intentionally damaged, right? It seems like physical threats to critical infrastructure are in the news more and more. I mean, is this actually a thing that's increasing, or is this just a trend we're paying more attention to now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Overall, if you look at the trend of threats is only growing. Last year,
Mm,
2023, was the year with the highest number of attacks, cyber attacks and physical attacks, as you described. On the cyber attacks, like critical infrastructure, had the massive number of attacks. The number,
right.
frequency, and sophistication of these attacks is only increasing. We ran a survey of more than 1,000 security executives, and it turns to be that more than 72% actually had a ransomware attack. So to your
Wow.
question, it looks like the trend is only going up. And yes, the physical attacks on internet cable, for example, cables like the one in the Red Sea, is only growing.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, so have you noticed any particular trends in? I kind of want to highlight physical attacks in our discussion today because they seem to be, yeah, obviously, I think it's without doubt, right, that attacks, just general cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, are on the rise, right? I think that's been well documented and established. But I think physical attacks are something that are at least in the media and maybe in the broader, sort of discussion of physical security, or not physical security, of critical infrastructure. I feel like physical threats tend to get, second level priority, kind of, right. They're not as common as cyber attacks, but they can be just as threatening. Are there any physical security trends particularly you've noticed, any trends in attacks or attack types, or are people doing the same things they have been for a while, just cutting cables and what have you?
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, the reason you see the cyber attacks more than the physical attacks is just because
Hmm.
of the number of attacks, the risk of these attacks to human lives and critical infrastructure versus the physical attacks on internet cables, for example. I
Hmm.
think that's the reason that you see more focus on that. Also, I think it's the state nation sponsor threat actors coming from China or Russia that you see more of, and these guys are focused mostly on cyber attacks. But like you've
Right.
mentioned, physical attacks is also something that you've seen lately, coming from Yemen, from the Houthis there. And at the end of the day, we'll see more of that. And I think
Hmm.
the public sector and the private sector need to collaborate to make sure that we have what we need to do to reduce the risk. And I also think that regulations more on that side should be more strict, coming from the government and the public agencies, to make sure that these attacks are being limited.
Right, and that was what I was going to actually ask you was, do government agencies like CISA, right, which already obviously
Mhm.
has a responsibility for critical infrastructure to begin with, right? You know, do we need to have them issuing new rules, basically requiring either, because I think this is a two-part question, right? I think CISA needs to pass more rules, but at the same time, is it clear who's responsible for some of these elements of physical security, right? Like, I mean, your IT and your OT teams, right? Clearly they manage things inside their data centers and they might deal with connectivity,
Mhm.
if a line goes down. But, in the case of this Sacramento airport cut, or even the Red Sea cables, right? Those are operating in no man's land, so to speak, right? They're in public space, or they're in international waters. Who's responsible for the security of these particular these cables in public sectors? Who has to claim responsibility for that?
Yes, it's a good question. I think it's clear who's responsible, and I think CISA
Okay.
is operating effectively to avoid that. But like we said before, since you have the cyber attacks as the majority risk here, and obviously you see it's state-to-state ransomware, espionage, and others that are more impactful, unfortunately, the focus is really there. And
Hmm.
so, yes, it's clear, but I do think we can do more on that front.
Right. So, I mean, you know, obviously the cybersecurity, and I think it's. I mean, I could ask you whether you think we're going to be able to get a handle on critical infrastructure cybersecurity, right? But I think, right. I don't know what your answer would be, but I'm guessing it's going to be something along the lines of that fact that it's a continually escalating war, right? One group figures out a way to circumvent systems, and then you secure them, and then someone else finds another 0 day, and it's this constant tug of war. When it comes to physical security, I mean, is there a similar tug of war, or are we looking at a situation where this is it just basically comes down to physical monitoring of hardware and equipment in the field? What can be done to prevent physical attacks, even though they're the minority? Is there a good way to prevent these, or is this just going to be the case of in a contested war zone, it's hard to keep track of if a power line is in a combat zone, or in rural California, it's hard to find where your lines run. I mean, what do you think we can be doing to better secure these assets?
Yeah, look, as I said before, I take the example in the Red Sea, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
these cables that are connecting APAC to EMEA, to Europe and the Middle East. And it's hard, and it's in the sea, right? So it's
Right.
hard to be able and really manage the situation if a threat attacker is really wanted to to cause damage there. Obviously, it's harder.
Right.
At the same time, you have different threat actors that are in the game here, unfortunately, and so it's harder. One, because it's government to government, state to state, and it's across the globe, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this example, outside of the U.S., and you have the EU also, monitoring that closely and trying to avoid. But at the end of the day, it's hard to manage that effectively and reduce the risk, which is the end goal at the end of the day. I do think that you cannot avoid that and reduce the risk to zero. But at the same time, I do think that collaboration between the private and the public sector with the different technologies that are out there can definitely reduce the risk and make sure that at least with the critical infrastructure, we are more in control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I feel like there's definitely the need to do something, because I feel like, right, as as we place more and more reliance on technology, which, I mean, I think globally, society even now, we're pretty essentially married to the internet, right? We need that kind of stuff to function, and we need electricity and the internet. And I mean, our reliance on those technologies is only increasing, and the threat we face when that infrastructure is damaged is only becomes more severe. I mean, are there any particular threats you guys have been tracking at Claroty, either physical security or cybersecurity to critical infrastructure, that you see as particular problems right now? Do people need to watch out for?
So we are focusing on cyber attacks, right?
Right.
And making sure we protect these cyber physical systems that are connected in these critical infrastructure organizations, industrial, manufacturing, healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And to answer your question, definitely. The digital transformation accelerate the need for connectivity with the obvious reasons, right? Real-time
Right.
analytics, reduce costs, better productivity, just being more competitive. So
Mm-hmm.
the reasons for more connectivity that is growing exponentially are obvious, but at the same time, the race to connectivity by far outpaces the ability to secure it. And so you'll see more and more risks state to states, like the Volt Typhoon coming from the Chinese
Mm-hmm.
state, threat actor operated organization. You'll see more ransomware. Like I said before, you had more than 72% of the critical infrastructure organizations experiencing a ransomware attack. And you'll see more of that, unfortunately. The good news is that we have more from a Claroty perspective on our technology to make sure that we cover end to end through a comprehensive platform in a proactive mode, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to reduce the risk. So providing visibility, understand what assets are connected, providing exposure management with vulnerability and risk management to really pinpoint these vulnerabilities that are critical to cover, and not just cover or try to cover all these vulnerabilities that are out there. Threat detection in continuous mode, securing remote operations. So to your question, we see a lot of attacks that are coming from remote operations that is secured in a very limited way. These are attacks that we see more and more that are coming, and this is where we focus at Claroty.
Yeah, well, hopefully more organizations will get the picture and start properly securing their their critical infrastructure, because it seems like that's just another one of the many challenges that we need to address, right? Is getting people to actually take this seriously once they properly identify the threat. So, Yaniv, thanks so much for coming in today and speaking with me on this topic.
Thank you very much, Brandon.